The Competition Commission has found that canned pilchards have gained popularity among South Africans as many households feel the pressure of the high cost of living and the effects of load shedding on their ability to store perishable foods. This is according to the Commission's Essential Food Price Monitoring Report, which also shows chicken is still favoured as a source of protein. This preference for canned pilchards has seen producers report a jump in sales volumes. The Commission says the most expensive source of protein per gram is beef, followed by canned pilchards, then chicken and eggs, while the least expensive is dry beans.
We picked up the rising popularity of canned fish from the reporting, which was done by the listed entities that trade in canned fish and produce canned fish. And across the board, there have been these volume increases, which they report. So their revenue increased, but not necessarily, but because of the combination of price and volume increases. And it's those volume increases from which we did infer the increased popularity. On the pricing, so that graph that I showed shows the price per gram of protein, which I guess is somewhat arbitrary, but since goods aren't sold on that basis. So of course, when you go to a store, you'll find your tinned fish, let's say it's 400 grams, and you might compare it to a packet of frozen chicken. And, the canned fish, once it is packed in on the shelf, will be in that 400 gram form, will probably come out cheaper than the bag of frozen fish. So, what is there in that graph is simply a function of this transformation where we've tried to get a comparable measure. So we make sure that we're comparing apples with apples when we try to see what has happened to protein sources. And I think then we settled on getting the price per gram of protein. So it's only more expensive on that basis and not necessarily on the basis which consumers make their decisions. And part of that popularity, I think, has been driven by a combination of it then being cheaper when it is in the 400 gram or however many gram can, as well as the perishability. You can be stored for a long time, which is important in the context of load shedding and other power interruptions, as well as now the wider ranges that are being introduced for flavor profiles, which some households might use to not have to spend on flavor enhancing ingredients.
All right, let's bring in now Dr. Frederich Kirsten from the School of Economics, University of Johannesburg. He joins us now via video link. Thank you so much for your time. Now, the report says the latest figures show that food inflation reached 5.1% in March 2024, while that's the lowest rate in food inflation since 2020. But South Africans, of course, continue to struggle. Just talk to us about what the latest report then reveals.
Yes, I think, thank you very much for having me, but I think very interestingly, the previous reports really showed a doom picture in terms of food prices increasing faster than inflation. But this report is actually creating a bit more optimism about the fact that we've seen now the lowest food price since 2020 in terms of its growing rate. And I think that is something that consumers might feel a bit positive about moving forward, as we also know that these measures were taken when load shedding was still very much affecting the economy, where now it's actually we're in our longest stretch without load shedding. So moving forward, there is room for optimism, but still on the shelves, people are still struggling because the living expenses are just so high for people to actually buy food. And I think that's so important to understand from this report is there are a stabilization within the prices and a declining pattern, but it's also important to see moving forward where it will take us regarding consumers' ability to actually fill up their grocery bags.
So I would imagine the Competition Commission then relies heavily on major food producer reports, for its findings. What is this information telling us in as far as, how the buying patterns are, as more and more South Africans find alternatives to food sources that are cheaper, largely, as you also pointed out, to how, the economy has been functioning over the past while?
I think that's actually one interesting part here is to see, especially the canned pilchards, which just shows you the changing consumer behavior here in terms of people are forced to now resort to more cost-effective protein intake, and therefore they go for the less costly options in terms of getting their protein in. And I think that's so important because those are markets that are now developing on its own in terms of it creates more indirect job opportunities in those markets. And I think that's so important to understand is as people in the economy are struggling, they're resorting to alternatives that are cheaper, especially with protein intake. And that will now result into expansions in those areas in terms of job opportunities. But then that also creates can create a wider spread between what consumers are paying versus what producers are producing the good for. And I think that's so important moving forward in terms of sustainability. But we do see this shift in consumers, especially since load shedding has impacted their consumption patterns, but also their economic condition in these harsh economic times we're currently living in.
Now, in as far as, the report saying that it's also examining commodity cost drivers along the value chain, explain what this means for us, in as far as we think of, farmers, as well as when it actually does get into, the space where consumers can then start buying or purchasing some of these goods.
Yes, so commodity prices are a very important element within the food price industry, and calculating it, I think commodity prices are a significant driver, not just domestically, but also internationally. And that's where the international external factors can come into play. But from the value chain's perspective, what is very important here to understand is within this value chain, you have the farmer's price, which is part of the producer's price or the producer's cost, then you have the producer's cost, and then you have the retail price. And it's important to understand the spread between those and how it changes. And they normally refer to the rocket feather example, where prices can soar like a rocket and then consumers have to take on that burden. But then when prices need to fall and it's falling from a producer side, it doesn't fall as quickly to the consumers. So that's always an issue within this value chain. And but recently what we've seen in this report is that the consumer and the producer is taking a lot of the burden together in terms of if there is a struggle with prices, then they do take these burdens together. And that's important because you don't want the consumers to take the entire burden and producers not to take the burden. You want an equal split between taking the burden of increasing prices, whether it's sunflower oil, whether it's eggs, whether it's meat, beef, all of that. You don't want the consumers to take an overburden from increasing prices.
And I'm glad you're using the word overburden because, it's not with their first choice that consumers are seeking for these alternative, products, because it is because they're struggling, as you also say. But you speak of the latest stats being somewhat of a more positive outlook, especially given the fact that the data was, taken during load shedding. So we can then easily say that we can see a reprieve soon for consumers, right?
I think there is a chance of that. I think it's still optimistic to say that, but also with warning. I think there's a lot of external factors that can still play out. I think the Middle East conflict is still playing a large part in terms of the world supply and the total value chain there, which might influence South African consumers again. But then also in South Africa, we're very dependent on imports, and that is independent on the rand. And if the rand strengthens or weakens in the coming months, that's also going to have a big influence. And I think, given we're moving into a very volatile period with South Africa in terms of elections and a very significant period, that can also play a role. So I think there is room for optimism, but I do think we need to also assess where we are currently with a lot of external volatility and internal volatility still in our markets, which might drive prices again upwards if not controlled in terms of some of the volatilities that might happen in the near future if we don't. So we need to assess that from a very analytical point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time on the show. Really do appreciate you unpacking all that for us, Dr. Frederich Kirsten from the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg.